ولا تعجل بالقرآن من قبل أن يقضى إليك وحيه وقل رب زدني علما.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأصلي وأسلم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا الكريم محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين وعلى أصحابه الصادقين والصديقين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله، وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وشر الأمور محدثاتها، وكل محدثة بدعة، وكل بدعة ضلالة، وكل ضلالة في النار. أعاذني الله وإياكم من النار. ثم أيها الإخوة الكرام, we begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Most High, as how He Jalla wa Ala deserve it. And then we send our salat and our salam upon the best of mankind, our Nabi, our Prophet Muhammad, and upon his families and his companions and those that are upon their way. And after that, we continue on with our weekly sittings, which regards to the book 𝔸𝕃-𝔸𝔸𝔸𝕀𝔻 min 𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸𝔸 companions of the most noble of the messengers, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, a book authored and compiled by Al-Hafiz An-Nawawi Yahya ibn Sharaf rahimahullah ta'ala. And we are still in the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, where he said that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, إِيَّاكُمْ وَالظَّنَّ فَإِنَّ الظَّنَّ أَكْذَبُ الْحَدِيثِ. Beware of suspicions, or avoid suspicions, for indeed suspicions are the worst of false tales, till the end of the hadith with its different narrations. And since we had took a break for a week or two, there's nothing wrong for us to review back from start about all of the traits that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had forbade thus far. And therefore, from the very first trait is the trait of suspicions. We are forbade from having suspicions upon weak evidences and such. And the commandment that we are commanded with is to have husnul dhann of others. To have husnul dhann of others, having good thoughts of others. And trait number 2 that we are forbade from making at-tahassus, which is being inquisitive of the things that do not concern us. And the opposite of that is to be busy with only the things that concern us. Number 3, at-tajassus, from making spying or digging up others' faults. And the opposite trait that we are commanded with is to cover the faults of others. And again we say that covering the faults of others does not mean to keep quiet on the mistake. Rather, the mistake is still needed to be rectified, but at the same time, if it is done behind the knowledge of the people, behind the knowledge of the public, then we keep it remain as that. And we rectify the matter in secrecy as well. Number 4, we are forbid from making a tanajush, At-tanajush is to raise the price of an item without the intention of buying it. And nowadays also included in at-tanajush is to give specifications to an item that which it does not possess, so as to raise its price. And the opposite commandment of that, the opposite trait that we are commanded is to be truthful and honest in our buying and selling. And the next trait that we are forbid is having hasad. Having hasad. And what is al-hasad? Al-hasad is to have, to be envious. Al-hasad is to be envious. And what is envious? What is this characteristic of being envious? Hoping that the blessing of others were to be removed from the other person, whether or not it will be transferred to himself or not. The main thing is that that blessing is removed from the other person. Aywa. And the opposite trait that we are commanded with is to want goodness for others. To want goodness for others. And then the next trait that we are forbid from is what is after al-hasad? Making a tanafus, competing with one another in the worldly affairs. Competing with one another in the worldly affairs. And the trait that is the opposite of that is to compete with one another in the affairs of the hereafter, as well as aiding one another in the worldly affairs. Aiding and helping one another in the worldly affairs. And after at-tanafus, we are forbid from at-tabaghud. At-tabaghud is to hate one another. We are forbid from hating one another. And we are forbid from doing the things that leads towards having hatred with one another. And the opposite trait that we are commanded with is to love one another. Love one another and to do the things that leads to having love between one another in the community. And then the next trait that we are forbid from is at-tadabur. At-tadabur is to turn one's back on the other. At-tadabur is to turn one's back on each other. And it has a literal meaning to it, meaning the physical sense of it, that you literally give your back to another person, turning away from him, betraying him in the times of need, and so on. And also there is a ma'nawi meaning of it, the non-physical sense of it, which is to differ with one another in the opinions, to turn away from one another in having different opinions. And the trait that we are commanded with is to help one another, aid one another, support one another, and not to betray one another, and not to give one's back to the other, as well as to be united, in an opinion, to be united upon one single opinion, even if it is a matter where opinions and differences of opinions are accepted. As how it is said by Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, al-khilafu sharrun. Al-khilaf sharrun. To differ is evil. To differ with one another is evil. طيب. And after At-tadabur is the prohibition of entering into the transactions where others had entered into it. We are forbid from entering into the transactions where others had already entered into it. And the opposite trade is that we are commanded with supporting one another in their trade and aiding and helping and promoting one another's businesses to help the community nurture love between one another. And then after that, also Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam forbade from making what? At-taqatu'. At-taqatu', which is to cut off ties with one another. And the opposite trade that we are commanded with is to connect the ties with one another. And after at-taqatu' is at-tahajur. We are forbid from making al-hajar, boycotting of one another. And we had explained in detail about this matter of boycotting. When is it permissible? When is it not? And what is the duration of the permissibility of boycotting and such? And the opposite trade that we are commanded with is to what? To enjoin and to make reconciliation with one another. And then after that, I believe we have covered all the prohibitions up till where we are. And there Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he changed his tone after prohibiting from certain numbers of trades. And there Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he changed his tone. And after prohibiting, he commanded with something. What did he say, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? وَكُونُوا عِبَادَ اللَّهِ إِخْوَانًا كَمَا أَمَرَكُمُ اللَّهِ. And be servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as fellow brothers. And be servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as fellow brothers, as how He Jalla wa Ala had commanded you all to do. This is where we stop. Naam. And therefore, the first thing that we can benefit from this sentence is that brotherhood or sisterhood in Islam must be upheld, as it is a commandment of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it is a commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Taking care of the brotherhood and the sisterhood in Islam is a commandment of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as well as a commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is commanding with it here, وَكُونُوا عِبَادَ اللَّهِ إِخْوَانًا, and be servants of Allah as fellow brothers. The commandment is from who? From Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Kama amarakumullah, as how Allah had commanded you all to do so. And therefore, it is a commandment of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it is a commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this affair, which is to be what? Servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as fellow brothers. And I believe we had also mentioned in the previous sitting that the servitude of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not complete. It's not complete until the servants becomes brothers and sisters with one another. The servitude of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only complete when the brotherhood and the sisterhood is upheld. Because if a person, he only becomes servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by himself, and he keeps away from others, and he does not treat others as his brothers, and she does not treat others as her sisters, then she is not upholding, and he is not upholding the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Na'am. And therefore he is not, and she is not becoming a complete servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because she is, and he is being disobedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this matter. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded him and her to be brothers and sisters with one another. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam commanded him and her to be brothers and sisters to one another. And if he is not upholding this commandment, and if he or she is not coming onto this commandment, then he or she is being disobedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore the degree of servitude is deficient. The degree of servitude here is deficient. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran in Surah Al-Hujurat, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ. The believers are nothing else than brothers. The believers are nothing else than brothers. And since Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded with taking care of the brotherhood and the sisterhood between us all, then it becomes an obligatory worship to fulfill. And since it is a worship to Allah, then it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves that the brotherhood and the sisterhood to be strong among his servants. Which means that the more a person, he takes care and he protects the brotherhood and the bond between the Muslims, the more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will love him. And the higher in rank he will rise, and the more rewards will he receive. And also, the more a person takes care of the brotherhood between the Muslims, the more is he upholding the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The more he takes care of the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the more he is adhering to the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the next thing that we can derive from this statement is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying that real brotherhood and real sisterhood in Islam do not contain anything that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had mentioned prior to this. Real brotherhood and real sisterhood in Islam does not contain anything that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had forbade prior to this statement. In all, about 11 or 12 traits that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had forbade in this hadith prior to these statements, all of these traits and all of these actions are those traits and actions that will diminish the brotherhood and the sisterhood, that will destroy the brotherhood and the sisterhood, and that will break the bond between the Muslims. Na'am. So all of them, from the very beginning of having suspicions, all the way to the trait that we had taken, that is to stay away from entering into the transactions that others had entered into it. All of them, they are the things that will break the bond of the Muslims, and that will nurture hatred, and that will nurture animosity between the Muslims and break up their ranks. And therefore, real brotherhood and real sisterhood do not contain any of those traits. Real brotherhood and real sisterhood in Islam do not contain any of those traits. And also what we can derive from here is that upholding the brotherhood and the sisterhood is an ibadah, is a worship from the worships to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as how we all know, worships, all of them contains what? Conditions. All of them must be taken from the Quran and the Sunnah upon the understanding of the Sahaba. And all of them have conditions, shurut, conditions to be met so that it will be proper. Just like if we want our salat to be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are conditions to be met. There are things to take care of. There are wajibat, there are sunan to take care of in the salat so that it will be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Am I right? And since brotherhood and sisterhood is a worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also, then it must have certain conditions met, certain conditions, certain shurut to be met and to be done and to be applied to it and to be acted upon so that it will be correct and that it will be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Real brotherhood and real sisterhood is the one that is derived from the Quran and the Sunnah upon the understanding of the Sahaba. Anything that a person thinks that might help the brotherhood and the sisterhood and it is not from the Quran and it is not from the Sunnah and it is not upon what the Sahaba and the companions understood and had done in their lifetime, then it will never help in increasing the brotherhood or the sisterhood. Because it is a worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and worship should be sufficed with what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had taught us all. Their brotherhood and the sisterhood in between the Sahaba, they are the real brotherhood and the sisterhood. The brotherhood and the sisterhood that is sought from them the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The brotherhood and the sisterhood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with. And therefore it is a must upon us all to imitate and to copy that type of brotherhood and sisterhood between us all. And also remember, my dear brothers and my sisters in Islam, brotherhood and sisterhood is a blessing. Is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Brotherhood and sisterhood is a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a favor from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is a grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon us all. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in his noble book in Surah Ali Imran, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, and hold fast all of you together to the rope of Allah and do not be divided among yourselves. وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ بِنِعْمَتِهِ إِخْوَانًا. فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ بِنِعْمَتِهِ إِخْوَانًا. And remember Allah's favor upon you all. For when you were enemies one to another, but He joined your hearts together so that by His grace, by His mercy, you became brothers in Islamic faith. You became brothers in the Islamic faith. So what we can derive from this verse is that us becoming brothers in Islam is a favor and a mercy and a grace from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ بِنِعْمَتِهِ إِخْوَانًا. and you all became brothers, and you all became brothers to one another by His grace, by His mercy. And just like any other blessing and favors and mercy of Allah, the most beneficent, the more you thank Allah for it, the more Allah will increase you in it. And the more you become ungrateful for it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish you for it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, in Surah Ibrahim, وَإِذْ تَأَذَّنَ رَبُّكُمْ لَإِنْ شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ وَلَإِنْ كَفَرْتُمْ إِنَّ عَذَابِي لَشَدِيدٌ. And remember when your Lord proclaimed that if you were to give thanks upon the grace and mercy, I will give you more. I will give you more of my blessings. But if you are thankless, then verily my punishment is indeed severe. Then my punishment is indeed severe. And therefore, barakallahu fikum, we should be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the brotherhood and the sisterhood that we are having right now. For indeed, it is a blessing from the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A grace from the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon us all. There are those who are Muslim in their land and they have no other people beside them at their land except for themselves. Yet we wake up from our sleep every single day, and we have brothers and we have sisters surrounding us all the way until we go back to our homes and we sleep again. Brothers and sisters are surrounding us all. Brothers in Islam, brothers in the same methodology and the same understanding of the religion of Allah surrounding us all. So do not be thankless to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this affair. Do not be thankless to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this affair, and let this brotherhood and this sisterhood that we had created go to waste. For indeed, if we are thankless, as how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, that His punishment is severe. And the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might be in this worldly life, and it might be delayed in the hereafter. Either or, the punishments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is severe. Either or, whether it will be in this worldly life or in the hereafter, the punishments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is severe. So do not play around with the punishments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After that, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam then further emphasized the matter of brotherhood. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he further emphasized the matter of brotherhood after commanding with it by stating that a Muslim is a brother to another Muslim. Al-Muslimu akhul Muslim. A Muslim is a brother to a Muslim. Any Muslim is a brother to another Muslim. And any Muslimah is a sister to another Muslimah. This is general to anybody at all. It does not mean that you give the rights of a brother to only those whom you are close with. La. No. Even if you are here in Singapore or in Malaysia or in another land from the lands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even all the way up to the North Pole, and a person is a Muslim, then he is your brother and she is your sister. From the very least that you can do is to spread the Islamic greetings, the salam. When two Muslims passes by each other in the streets, na'am, the very least that they can do to uphold the Islamic brotherhood and the Islamic sisterhood is to send and to give each other the salam. How can a community grow and be strong when two Muslims passes by each other and they do not give the salam to one another, and they sometimes even intentionally look away from one another? Not of that sort. A Muslim is a brother to a Muslim, as how the Prophet ﷺ he said, give the salam, spread the salam, talk to each other, ask of one another about each other, ask of one another about each other, and this will create a bond, and this will lead towards a healthy, harmonious community. Al-Imam Muslim rahimahullah ta'ala collected in his Sahih to the great companion Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu that he narrated Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam saying, لا تدخلون الجنة حتى تؤمنوا ولا تؤمنوا حتى تحابوا أولا أدلكم على شيء إذا فعلتموه تحاببتم أفشوا السلام بينكم. You shall not enter paradise until you have Iman, until you have Islamic faith. And you will not have Islamic faith, you will not have Iman until you love one another. Should I not direct you to a thing which if you were to do it, it will foster love amongst you? Spread the salam between you. Spread the salam between you. Say assalamu alaikum. It is the least that a person can do to one another to uphold the Islamic brotherhood and the Islamic sisterhood. The sisters are not excluded here as well. When you passes by another sister and you see signs of Islam from her, like the hijab and all, then give and spread the salam to her, as she is your sister in servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And since a Muslim is a brother to another Muslim, and a Muslimah is a sister to another Muslimah, the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam again further emphasizes on keeping this bond strong and healthy, and he further warns against the things that a brother do not do to his brother, or a sister do not do to her sister. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what did he say after that? Al-Muslimu akhul Muslim. A Muslim is a brother to a Muslim. إيش؟ لا يظلمه ولا يحقره ولا ولا. You don't have the hadith in front of you? إيش؟ لا يظلمه ولا يحقره ولا يخذله. And then التقوى هنا. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam forbade certain traits, and then he commanded with brotherhood. Correct? Which means that the traits that came prior to that commandment are all the traits that what? Breaks up the brotherhood. After commanding with the brotherhood, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam returned back to forbidding certain actions. He returned back to forbidding certain actions. He warned against oppressing, and he warned against betrayal and forsaking, and he warned against looking down on one another, and he warned against spilling unlawful blood, and he warned against taking wealth of another unlawfully, and he warned against dishonoring another's dignity. And again, we will take these forbidden traits one by one, inshaAllah tabaraka wa ta'ala, so that we will be in full knowledge of what they are, and so that we can stay far away from these forbidden traits. The very first trait that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam again forbade after commanding with brotherhood is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam forbade against making oppression of one another. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "La yadhlimuhu." A Muslim is a brother to a Muslim. La yadhlimuhu. He does not oppress the other. He does not what? Oppress the other. Which means that oppression is something that denies brotherhood. And just likewise, brotherhood denies any form of oppression. And oppressing one another with all sorts of its form will break up and destroy the brotherhood between the Muslims. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam warned and forbade against oppression. Any form of oppression. Any form of oppression is impermissible in Islam. And the act of oppression is one of the major sins. Whether is it in the form of words, oppressing one another in the form of what? Words. Or whether is it in the physical actions, oppressing one another with the physical actions. All of them are not allowed. All of them are not allowed, and all of them are major sins in Islam. Al-Imam Muslim rahimahullah collected in his Sahih to the authority of the great companion Jabir ibn Abdullah radiyallahu anhu, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Ittaqu dhulma fa inna dhulma dhulumatun yawm al-qiyamah." Be wary of committing oppression, for oppression is darkness. For oppression will be darkness on the day of resurrection. For oppression will be darknesses on the day of resurrection. One dhulm, one oppression will become dhulumat. Will become what? Darknesses on the day of resurrection. And also Al-Imam Muslim collected in his Sahih, in a long hadith, that the great companion Abu Dharr radiallahu anhu narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, and this type of hadith is named as what? Al-Hadithu Al-Qudusi. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the hadith Qudusi, "Ya ibadi, inni harramtu dhulma ala nafsi, waja'altuhu bainakum muharraman, fala tadhalamu." O my servants, I have forbidden oppression for myself, and I have made it forbidden amongst you. So do not oppress one another. So do not oppress one another. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in the Quran, in Surah Ali Imran, "Wallah la yuhibbu dhalimin." Wallah la yuhibbu dhalimin. And Allah does not love the oppressors. Allah does not love the oppressors. And a Muslim is supposed to invoke and to supplicate to Allah and to ask Allah to not make him fall into being an oppressor. A Muslim, it is upon him and her to invoke Allah and to ask and to supplicate to Allah to not make him or her fall into being an oppressor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Mu'mineen, رَبِّ فَلَا تَجْعَلْنِي فِي الْقَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ. رَبِّ فَلَا تَجْعَلْنِي فِي الْقَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ. My Lord, do not make me amongst the people who are oppressors. My Lord, do not make me amongst the people who are the oppressors. And so it is upon a Muslim to constantly invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make him far, far away from this evil trait of oppressing another person. Al-Dhulmu Dhulumat. Al-Dhulmu Dhulumat. One oppression will be darknesses in the day of resurrection. All of this shows that Islam do not accept any form of oppression. Instead, it warns and it discourages all types of oppression. And therefore, a Muslim, he should be far away from oppressing anyone or even anything. Islam not only forbids us from oppressing the living beings, but Islam also teaches us to not oppress even the non-living things, even the ghayru-aqil, the one that does not possess what? Intellect. We all have read the hadith of a person riding the bull, is it? The bull. And he oppresses the bull by riding it. And the bull turned to him and said, Ma khuliqtu lihada. I was not created for this. I was not created for this. Even to an animal, it is impermissible for us to oppress them. And we all have read about the women who entered the hellfire due to a what? A cat. Due to a cat, she was punished with the hellfire. Why? Because she oppressed this animal. She oppressed the cat. By what? By keeping it locked and not letting it eat from the land. She oppressed a ghayru aqil, a non-intellectual being. And because of that, she was punished with the fire. So Islam not only teaches us to not oppress living beings and the intellectual beings, it also teaches us to what? To respect and to not oppress even the non-intellectual beings. Even the non-intellectual beings. We will continue after the adhan, insyaAllah tabaraka wa ta'ala. Na'am. So this is the trait that we are forbid from coming onto it, that is to oppress another person or another thing or another being. And next week we shall continue, insyaAllah tabaraka wa ta'ala, with the opposite trait to al-dhulm, which is al-adl, being just. And we will talk about that trait in further detail, insyaAllah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And I forgot to mention just now about the affairs of brotherhood. It is not sufficed that one waits for another person to be a good brother to him. Rather, he himself should start being and give importance in being a good brother to others as well. As how we want others to treat us nicely and in a good manner, and being a good brother to us, it is a must also that we ourselves start to be a good brother and a good sister to the others, and we do not wait for things to happen to us. Rather, we take the initiative to to be and to start the one, to start being the one that is better. Naam. This is what we have for this week. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك لا إله إلا أنت استغفرك وأتوب إليك. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.